Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Chullin, Daf Lamed Aleph. I'll remind everyone that the Sukkah Challenge is starting tomorrow, so if you want to get people to be learning over the summer, it's a great opportunity, 4 days a week. We'll finish Masechet Sukkah just in time for the Chagim. Okay, this week's learning is sponsored by Robert and Paula Cohen in loving memory of Helen Cohen, Hannah Bat Yitzchak Nechemia, my grandmother. She was a community leader and role model to all who knew her. Today's stuff is sponsored by Judy Schwartz in loving memory of her Baba Frida Sima, Eisenberg Krauss, Bat Nachman, on her 42nd yahrzeit. Baba, oldest of 10 children, came to America alone at 15 with the dream of continuing her education instead of being married off at 16. She never got that formal education as she had to work and send money to bring her brothers to America, but she and my Zadie helped raise me, and her life lessons are part of what makes me who I am. She would have loved the idea of women learning Daf Yomi, Yehi Zichra Baruch. Today's stuff is sponsored by Danny Sadanoff in honor of the 85th birthday of his mother, Joan Sadanoff Katz. May she live to 120, pioneer of women's tefillah and Jewish learning. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started. We have a bit of a long daf, so we're going to get started with the story that we saw about shooting the arrow at the bird. So Rava, have a badik giram at the bottom of Lamed Amud Bet, starting there. He would check the arrows, Rav Yonah bar Tachlifa, to make sure they didn't have any nicks in them. Okay, and we're going to basically, since we were talking about the chetz shachut and the connection between the arrow and the shchita, we're now going to see that you could actually kill a bird by shooting an arrow in the sky at the bird. We're going to talk about a few halachic issues that come up. Number one, we already just saw, you have to check that the arrow has no nicks in it. And he would shoot the birds while they were in flight. Problem number two, well, maybe it's going to be chalada, which is if the arrow goes in kind of in the side of the neck and goes in between the two simanim, you're going to have a problem of chalada. Well, chazina gidfe demiparme. They saw the feathers, right after the bird was killed. They saw that the feathers were off on the front of the neck, and then it was obvious that it didn't go in the side, and there wasn't an issue of chalada. Third issue and final issue, vahabai kisui. You have to cover the blood, right? And how are you going to cover the blood if the bird is mid-air and the blood comes spurting down? Well, v'chitem, it's a little unpleasant. Maybe you do cover it, okay? In other words, wherever the blood falls, so you cover the blood there. Well, Hamar Rabbi Zera Amar Rav, Rabbi Zera said in the name of Rav, you have to also put dirt underneath and dirt on top. Now, if you're going to shoot the bird in midair, right, you don't know where the bird's going to fall. How are you preparing the dirt underneath before the blood falls on it, right? It needs a layer on top and on the bottom and a layer on top. How do we know that? Shenemal v'kisau ba'afar. Afar lo nemar. It doesn't say cover it with it. Well, it's a little tricky because in Hebrew it really does. It would be the way to say it, but they're saying kisau afal, cover it with dust, but it doesn't say afar, ela be'afal. Now, the way they understand be'afal, right, it could mean with dirt, which is what it means, but what they mean to say is it even means on dirt, okay? The be could be translated in both ways. Also on the afar. So therefore, from there you learned, right, that you need afar milamesh, hashochet tzarich shitein afar lamata, v'afar lamalo. Okay, you have to put the dirt both below and above. And therefore, how on earth are you doing that in this case? To which they answer, what do you mean? Demazmin le'lafar dekula patka. Really should be pakta. Pakta, pay and bet switch often. So what it means is in the bikta, in that whole bik'ah, that whole valley. What you did was you set the soil in the whole area where you were shooting the bird. Now, Rashi says there's two options. Either you did it just, and the truth is the commentaries have a big debate about what exactly do you have to do here. Either the second option Rashi brings is you just do it with words. You say, okay, this whole bik'ah, all the soil that's there, that's going to be I'm setting it out, and setting aside in words is sufficient. But Rashi also, in his first interpretation, said you actually have to hoe the land or break. You have to kotesh, break it up into pieces. You have to do something to all the soil in the area, and that wherever it falls, then you've prepared it. So you might have to actually prepare it just in words only, or maybe in actions. And then the question is, what exact action is a debate among the commentaries? Okay, so now we resolved that whole issue of the bird, and now we move on. The Mishnah talked about shochet vihitis. Right, the Mishnah was worried about the issue of drisa, which is pushing the knife into the neck of the animal, and it said, well, if you cut off the head in one action, because you're supposed to do, remember, holachan hava'ah, back and forth action. That's a more slow way of killing the animal. as opposed to pushing the knife in. Pushing the knife in will disqualify it. But if you did it in one direction and the head came off with only the one direction, it depends how long the knife is. And we said it needed to be the length of the width of the animal's neck. Okay, but we also explained what it meant is, right, and this Rabbi Zera is going to say, and this is why when we explain the Mishnah, we explained it like this, Rabbi Zera, melot tzavar chutz l'tzavar. It's not just that the length of the knife is the same as the width of the animal's neck, it's in addition to the neck, okay, meaning it needs to be, well, now the question is going to be exactly this, maybe I won't even explain this yet, but they're going to ask the question of Rabbi Zera. Melot tzavar v'chutz l'tzavar k'melot tzavar, dehavule trade tzavare, do we mean the neck, right? A neck's length, the width, right? The length of the width of the neck. Again, the length of the knife is the length of the width of the neck. In addition to the neck, does that mean in addition to, you mean plus two necks, basically? The length of the knife has to be the width of two necks. And then we can assume, right, the first neck kind of cut it, and then the second neck's length, right, it was completely cut it, severed it. And then the length of the knife is basically the length of two neck widths of an animal. Maybe it means the length of the neck in addition to the neck, meaning just a little bit more than the length of one neck. Does it just need to be like one length's neck is not enough, but in other words, again, the length of the knife being equal to the width of the neck, maybe just plus a little bit more. Maybe not two necks. Maybe it's just one neck plus a little more. Maybe you just need that extra little bit. It's not clear from the Mishnah because the Mishnah really just said, okay, I'm just going to read it again. Im yesh besakim melot tzavar. Okay, melot tzavar means one neck's length. Now Rabbi Zera comes and says one length's the width of one neck, right? The length of one neck's width. But a little, right? Now it doesn't say. Now he said, and more, but more what? Like in addition to. Did he mean two necks or did he mean a neck plus a bit? Okay, so that's the question. Tashma, we're going to learn it from the end of the Mishnah, because what does the Mishnah say? Hayashochet v'tiz, or the next case, shnei rashim bevat echad. If you take two necks and you cut them, and you know, in one motion, you cut off both necks. Im yesh, you slaughter both animals. Im yesh besakim melot tzavar echad kasher. It says if you have one neck's length, right? Again, width of a neck's, with the width of the animal's neck, that was the length of your knife, it would be good. Now, this can't be my melot tzavar echad. It can't be just one length, one width length, because if that's the case, right? Ilay ma melot tzavar echad v'tu lo, if it meant exactly one, like exactly what it says, right? And what they mean here is, and let's say you just said, and a little bit more, that makes no sense, the Mishnah. Because if in one animal you need the width of a neck plus a little bit more, it can't be that you're going to need the exact same thing, the width of one animal's neck plus a little bit more for two animals. That's not logical. Obviously, you're going to need something more, and therefore, it must be obvious that melot tzavar echad means in addition to two, right? It basically means once you get past the two animals' necks, the width of that one plus the width of a third, which means shma mina melot tzavar chutz tzavar shma mina. It means when he says, Rabbi Zera says, when we said one neck in the first part of the Mishnah, we meant one neck in addition to the other neck's width. Okay, so it's basically the length of the knife has to be, for one animal, it has to be two widths of animals to the length of the width of two animals, and for two animals it has to be three. Okay, and that makes a lot more sense. Otherwise basically it's the same length for one animal and two animals, and that would make no sense, because the whole idea again is that you have a long enough knife that it's able to slaughter both animals in without doing drisa. Okay, so we resolved that. Last part of this Mishnah. Now the Mishnah said at the end, but im holich ve'evi afilu koshu afilu be'izmo kshera. If you did a back and forth motion, okay, then we don't care how long your knife is. It doesn't need to be a long knife at all. If the head was cut off after doing a back and forth motion, even any length of the blade, or even a scalpel. So notice the language here. There's even a very small knife and even a scalpel. So why does it say both? I'm going to try to figure this out. So first, when they talk about the scalpel, Rav Menashe says, Amar Rav Menashe, be'izmal she'en lo karnayim. It has to have no, now Rashi explains this, what are these karnayim? Karnayim means literally horns. But what it means is on these scalpels, they often had decorative elements that were jutting out of it. And that would be obviously a problem, like we've seen before with nicks in the knife, be the same kind of issue that you're going to cause the animal to be a treifa. So it can't have any karnayim. That's point number one. Amalei Rav Acha bereid Rav Avia Rav Menashe. Now Rav Acha says to Rav Menashe, Machtamai, what about a needle? So Amalei, Rav Menashe says back to him, Machta mifsa baza, what do you mean a needle? If you use a needle to try to kill an animal, what are you going to do? You're going to make a hole in the neck first. That's going to make the animal a treifa. There's no way that's going to work. So he says, no. Machta de ushkafe mai. What I meant is the tanners, okay, for the people who cut leather, what I was talking about is their kind of needle, which instead of being pointy, it's a flat surface, okay? It's a little bit more like a knife. It's just very short, okay? The part of the knife is very short. It's more like a needle. It's wider than a needle, but it's very short. And that's what I'm talking about, okay? Not something that has pointy. It's not pointy. It's like a flat knife almost, okay? With, it's sharp on the sides. So, Amarle Tanina, he says, let's derive it from our Mishnah, because our Mishnah said two things. It said even kolshu, any length, and even a scalpel. So, my lav, so afilu kolshu, what's that referring to? My lav, machta de ushkafe, it must be talking about this kind of a knife, because it's a really, really short knife, right? Really short blade. So they say, no, the kolshu is referring to the scalpel. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. Say it's referring to the scalpel. It says even kolshu and even a scalpel. So now you're going to say that even kolshu means even a scalpel and even a scalpel. That would be saying the same thing twice. Ismo behedikatanila says it explicitly. So they say no, perusha kamefarish. What it's coming to say is, the second part of that sentence is defining the first part. The first part is even any length. My kolshu, and how much is that? And that's what's an example of kolshu? In Ismail, a scalpel. That's what we mean when we say kolshu, and that's how to read it. And hachinam mistabra, and then that would exclude this knife of the people who are cutting leather. So they say, and I'm even further going to prove it. Hachinami mistabra the isakadatach machta de ushkafe. If you thought the kolshu meant this knife, this very very short knife that they used to cut leather. You wouldn't even need to talk about a scalpel because the scalpel is even longer than that. So you wouldn't even need to mention scalpel. And therefore it's obvious that we're not talking about this machta de ushkafe, and machta de ushkafe is not going to work. However, the Gemara now is going to suggest, not necessarily. You could still say that the kolshu is machta de ushkafe, and then the ismul needs to be mentioned also. Why? And this brings us back to the first sentence of this section. Ismail itztri. You would need Ismail still. Why? Even though it's longer, what's the problem with an Ismail? Well, salkadat hachamina ligzor Ismail she'en lo karnaim atu Ismail she'yesh lo karnaim kamash malan. You might have thought, okay, it says really small knife, which is your one that they use to cut leather. But then you still need to say you can use a scalpel, because you might have thought, since a lot of scalpels come with these karnayim on them, these decorative elements that cause the animal to be a treifa, if you use them to slaughter and you can't use them, maybe we can't use any scalpels, because if you use that scalpel, you might come to use one that has those horns on it, again, however we're going to call these things, but these decorative elements that are going to basically ruin the animal and make it a treifa. Maybe you can't use any scalpel, because maybe you'll accidentally use those. And that's why it comes to teach you, no. You can use this, again, the tanner's knife, even though it's really, really short, and the scalpel, which is longer, but since there's types that have other things going on that are going to ruin your animal, well, you could still use the ones that don't, okay? And that's a different alternative way to read it. So now we're left really with lack of clarity. We thought it was so clear. It wasn't referring to this machta de ushkafe. Now we suggest at the end, maybe it is. Okay, so I'm going to summarize this part, because now we're going to move on to a totally different topic. This will be your summary instead of at the end of the section. We had 3 sections here. One was slaughtering the birds in the air and what the 3 halachic problems are and how they resolve them. In this case of Rav Yonah Bar Tachlifa, who was doing this. Number 2, if you're shochet v'itiz, you need a neck's length. Neck's length, again, the width of a neck's length. The length of the knife should be, it's very hard for me to say this, should be the same as, right, the length of the width of the neck of the animal. But in the end, we said it's, and Rabbi Zera said, and more than that. How much more than that? A little bit, or a whole other width of a neck. And in the end, we said, 1 animal, 2 neck widths. 2 animals, 3 neck widths. Okay, and we used the second case to prove the only way to read the first case was like that. And then we had this issue of the Ismail and why the language of Kolshu and Ismail, and we had 2 ways of reading it. Okay, new Mishnah. Now we're going to get into a super, super interesting issue of intent. Okay, we have intent in many, many sugyot. It comes up in Masechet Shabbat, with Darshen and Mitkaven, and we've had it in many other sugyot, and we're going to have a scale of intent of actions. And what's going to be considered, right? We had also like lack of intent when it came to nizikin, damages, right? Where there we don't care what your intent is. We had intent when it came to sacrifice, how important your intent is, right? Without real intent and proper intent and the exact intent is not going to be valid. So here we're going to talk about what do you need for slaughtering, and we're going to talk about some other cases as well. So it's a bit of a jumpy sugya, I would say. We're going to organize it as we go through. Nafla sakim v'shachta. So if your knife falls and somehow magically slaughters an animal in a kosher way, okay? It then, goes in this, I guess it was long enough that it cut the animal, because unless it boomerang back maybe, and then you could have holacha v'hova. I don't know, but somehow forgetting about, right, we're talking probably pretty theoretical here, but if your knife somehow falls and slaughters the animal or the bird, maybe the bird is easier to slaughter, but in that kind of situation, even if it all happens the way it's supposed to and everything else is right, it's no good. Why? Shenemar v'zavachta v'achalta. It says in the pasuk, you slaughter and then you eat. What do we need here? Ma she'ata zovech, ata ochel. Okay? What you slaughter, zovech is slaughter, that's what you eat. And you didn't slaughter this. There was no human action involved at all. Okay? So the first intent we're going to discuss is, right, no intent for any action whatsoever. No human involvement, nothing. Okay? The knife falls on its own. I mean, maybe you could say human involvement, someone probably left it in a precarious spot, but no human action whatsoever, and that's not going to work. Comes the Gemara and says, Tama dinafla. Well, the Mishnah specifically says the knife fell by itself. Hahi pilahu, what if the person knocked it over and pushed it off the table, let's say, and it falls on the animal and slaughters it? Kshera. And we're going to assume this is fine, even though the person didn't intend to slaughter. But the person did intend for the knife to fall. Okay? And since the knife did an action while it was falling, that's enough of intent. Intent, right? There was what you have here that wasn't in the previous case was human involvement, even though you don't have intent to slaughter. So comes the Gemara and says, Man tana de lo b'ina kavana l'shchita. Who's the Tana who says you don't need intent for shchita? And we're going to refer back to a sugya we already discussed earlier in the Masechet. Amarava Rabbi Natan. This is Rabbi Natan's approach. Detani Oshaya is the area de min chevraya. Oshaya, who is the youngest of his chevra, okay, of the rabbis, of his colleagues, he brought this braita. Zarak tzakin l'na'atza bakota. Remember this, right? You're shooting darts. So you take a knife and you want to throw it into, right? Not necessarily doing it for shooting darts, but you take the knife and you throw it into the wall. On the way, it slaughters an animal. Rabbi Natan machshir v'chachamim poslim. Okay, so what do you see here? There's a machloket. Machloket, whether it works or doesn't work. Rabbis say you had no intent to slaughter. That doesn't work. According to Rabbi Natan, it's enough that you had intent for an action, right? If you look at the Mishnah, v'zavachta v'achalta, sounds like you have to have intent to slaughter. Comes Rabbi Natan and says you don't need intent to slaughter. You just need intent for an action of moving the knife. Okay? And if the knife, while you moved it, kills the animal, that's fine. Hu tanela v'hu amrla. So Rabbi Yeshaya brought this braita, and then he actually paskin. Now, who would you usually paskin in a case like this? The rabbis, because they're the mainstream position. But surprisingly, he says halacha ke Rabbi Natan. We paskin like Rabbi Natan here that you don't need kavanah. Okay, only at the very end of the daf are we going to see why he paskins like Rabbi Natan. But the first question we're going to ask, now you have to get the characters here. This was all Rava. Rava came and said, first we inferenced from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah said it falls on its own as opposed to a person making it fall. If the person makes it fall, the Mishnah, we're going to assume, says it's okay. And Rava says this is Rabbi Natan's position. Okay, and then he brings the Bright of Oshaya, but he basically says this is Rabbi Natan's position. But now they say, V'ha'amar Rava chadazim, the Rava said this already. We saw this on Daf Yubet. Ditnan, v'kulan sheshachatu, v'achirim ro'inotan. I think this was all came up in Yubet, but I'm not sure. But anyway, earlier in the Masechet, what did we see? The Mishnah is obviously on Daf Bet. This is the first Mishnah of our Masechet. V'kulan sheshachatu, v'achirim ro'inotan, shchitatan kshera. This is the cheresh shota v'katan, who slaughter. And what did we say? If somebody's watching, the slaughtering is good. Now, Amrinan, they asked, Man tana de lo bai kavanah l'shchita. Who's the Tana who doesn't need intent here? What do you mean? These three people don't have da'at, they don't have knowledge, they're not able to have intent because they're not smart, right? They're not wise, they don't have what we call halachic knowledge, which is a certain age, a certain capability. They don't have it. So, obviously, there's no kavanah. You can't count their kavanah as anything. So, therefore, who's the Tana who says you don't need kavanah for shchita? Amar Rava, Rabbi Natan he. And Rava says this is Rabbi Natan. So why is Rava saying it on this case when he already said it there? Tzricha. Rava needs to tell you this. Why? Because you might have thought to differentiate between the cases. And again, we're talking about a scale of kavana. So in the end here, we're not differentiating. So they're not in different places on the scale. They're both in the same place where this is enough kavana for Rabbi Natan. But you might have thought, Yashmin and Hatan, if you had it just there with the Chirishot of a Katan, you might have said, look, there is intent there. Why? What's their intent for? They're trying to cut, right? They're trying to slaughter. They just maybe don't understand what shchita is, but there is an intention to cut the animal, to cut the neck. But in our case, you were shooting a knife into the air. There was no intent to even cut the animal. The animal just happened to be in the way and got sliced along the way. And if you said it by our case, you would have said, at least in our case, who threw the knife? Someone who has halachic capability of knowledge, of understanding. But maybe you'd say there, that's not any sort of kavanah, even though we said before and a minute ago, maybe that was more kavanah because it was kavanah actually for the action that we're looking for, which is cutting the neck or cutting the simanim. But in this case, but maybe that's actually a worse case because the person who's doing it doesn't have halachic knowledge. They can't do actions in general that are important. So you might have thought maybe that doesn't work, but maybe our case would work because it was done by a ben da'at, by someone who does have knowledge. And therefore it's tzricha. That's why Rava needed to tell us in both cases, Rabbi Natan's opinion, this is the relevant one. These are both considered cases without kavanah, and yet they're relevant because there was an action behind it, even though it wasn't the intent for the proper action. Or there wasn't intent. Okay. Now, we're going to stop our sugya for a minute, or a few minutes, or maybe a while. Come back to our Mishnah later within this other sugya. Now we're talking about a nida itmar. Nida shene'en savatavla. Okay, onus could be called rape. That's not what we're talking about. No rape here. It's a woman who accidentally or someone forces her somehow. We don't know. We're going to get to it at the very end of the daf what exactly happened here. A nida shene'en sa accidentally ends up tavla. Okay, she's a nida. She ends up, she's done like her 7 days. She's fine. She's ready to go to the mikveh, but she doesn't intend to go to the mikveh. And she falls, somehow ends up, we don't know how, in a body of water that's a kosher mikveh. Okay, whether she is in a mikveh, actually what we call a mikveh, or she's in an ocean that works as a mikveh, a body of water that works as a mikveh. She's in the mikveh, okay? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. So she didn't intend to tovel at all, okay? So we're now going to have another machloket. This time machloket between two Amoraim, Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, before we had this machloket between two Tanaim, Rabbi Natan and the rabbis. Now we have machloket between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Rav says, Tehora lebeita, she can go now and be together with her husband. She's gotten rid of Nida for those purposes. However, what can't she do? Asura lechol betruma. Now, a Nida can't eat truma because she's impure. She still can't eat truma. What are we differentiating between? Seems like, and we're going to see this inside soon, Chullin and Kodshim, right? We always have often have a higher level of sanctity for Kodshim. So Truma is Kodshim, right? It's not sacrificial, but it's holy items. So she's allowed to be with her husband. It's a very weird situation. According to Rav, we're going to view her as semi-tahor. Tahor for her husband, not for kachim, not for truma. And obviously not sacrificial meat or anything like that. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Beita lo tahara. He says it doesn't work at all. Okay, you can see that Rabbi Yochanan is much more similar to the rabbi's position. Right? No intent here. So it doesn't work. So the first thing we have is we want to figure out the differentiation that Rav makes. Okay, there's going to be a bunch of parts to the sugya. This is where it gets a little confusing. I'm going to try to organize it. So we have the sugya of nida, and now we're going to see what's the reason for Rav to differentiate. So first we ask a question. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. Amalei Rava le Rav Nachman. So Rava asked Rav Nachman the following: LeRav da Amar Torah lebeitav asura lechol b'truma avon karei tutra isur mita mebaya. Now it's true I said chulin kachim, but in the world of punishments, nida is much more severe. I mean, they're both pretty severe. But if you eat truma when you're tamei, you get death by the hands of God. But karei is worse than death by the hands of God. They're both kinds of death by the hands of God. But if a man sleeps with his wife when she's in nida, they're both going to get kareit. So we basically have a more severe one is actually taken care of, and the less severe one isn't taken care of. That doesn't make any sense. So Rav Nachman answers, Amarle, ba'ala chulin hu v'chulin lo bai kavana. He goes back to what I said, which is there's the chulin kachim distinction. Kachim, to become tahor for kachim, you need intent. For chulin, non-sacrificial items, you don't need intent. This, by the way, goes back to all the importance of intent in Masechet Zvachim that we talked about in Menachot, how important intent is. Intent is very important in sacrifices. So intent to purify yourself is important, but not in, not in chulin. Okay? Now we want to know where do we get this distinction that chulin doesn't need intent. So the next stage is to figure out, so we have Rav Nachman's explanation, why Rav would differentiate. Now we're going to say, where does Rav Nachman get this from? Okay, this differentiation between chulin and kachim. So menatemer, we're going to have two attempts because the first one's not going to work. Ditnan. Gal shenitlash. Okay, you're standing, let's say, in the shallow water of the ocean, and then a huge wave comes on top of you. Now you happen to be, let's say, in Nida, and this huge wave, ubar ba'im se'ah, there's 40 se'ah, which is the minimum requirement for a mikveh. Okay, usually you think you dunk in the mikveh. Well, this time that mikveh dunked on you. Okay, the mikveh basically dumps its water on you. V'nafal ha'adam va'ala kelim. Now it's you who's impure and your vessels. So, to'orim, everything is fine. Now, meaning everything is purified by this mikvah falling on top of you. My love. Now, because it says a person and the kelim, they're going to make an assumption here. My love adam dumia de kelim. Isn't it the person? We're going to assume because they're right next to each other, they do this often. It must be in the same manner, meaning, ma kelim de la mechavne. Well, now the kelim didn't have any intent that the water was going to fall on them. They don't have a mind to be able to think about that. Afadam nami lo bai kavana. So it must be the person doesn't need intent either for the wave to have gone on top of him or her. Okay, so there you have it. Without intent, the person became pure. And we're assuming pure for purposes of chulin. Okay, they don't talk about it. Now, mimai, they say, who's to say that? You could explain this verse the other way, which is, biyoshevu mitzapeh askinan, ematai yitale shagal. Maybe you were sitting in the shallow area of the water, waiting, when is that wave going to come on me? And maybe you wanted the wave to fall on you so that you could become pure. And turning now to the top of Amud, the kelim dumiyah da adam, and now we're going to do the juxtaposition the opposite way. The vessels are like the person, meaning, ma adam de bi'inan kavana, af kelim nami. Now, how's kelim gonna have kavana? You might have thought this. I thought about this when I read it the first time, which is techamachaven lehu adam. Well, there's a person who's totally in the kelim, right? So when the wave comes upon the person and the vessels, maybe it was that the person said, I want this wave to come upon me and the vessels. I'm just sitting waiting, right? My hands crossed, just waiting for the water to come on top of me. Maybe they don't like to go in the water. They're scared of the waves, but if it falls on top of me, I'll just wait for it to happen. And that would work. Now, you might say, okay, obviously this works. What's the problem? Okay, well, why do I need a mission to tell me this? Of course, if 40 se'ah falls on top of them, the person had intent, of course it's fine. No, maybe really it's trying to tell you, even without intent, which then would prove our point. But they say no. Even that's a chiddush. Why? And this is a total side issue, okay? Because now this source doesn't help us at all for our purposes. But ma'u detema ligzor mishum chardali chol gshamim. Inami ligzor rashimatu kifin. Kamashmalan de lo gazlinan. So now they suggest there might have been two possible reasons why they would have said this doesn't work. Because if you allowed this, maybe people would think you could allow something else.
The first is a chardalit shel gshamim. That means, ever have it where there's this huge downpour and it creates, right, there's an incline and it creates like a huge stream of water. Now you can't tovel in something like that, okay? It's first of all not deep enough for you to really tovel in, and it doesn't work. So you might have thought if the wave falls on top of me and that works, maybe I'll think that this stream that made from rainwater would work. Or maybe we'll say ligzor rashin atu kipin. Now a wave has two parts of it. There's the rosh, the head of the wave, which as the wave comes on top of you, right? That's the part that falls on top of you. But it makes an arc, and the arc is full of air, no water. So you might have thought maybe we should forbid and say, listen, the wave falling on top of you doesn't work, even though there's 40 se'ah, because you might think that if the vessels or you're standing in the arc part of the wave, maybe that works. And it doesn't. How do we know it doesn't? Well, we're going to see right now. It's not matbilim because it's really just air. Okay? Fine. That's a Mishnah that proves that. Anyway, the point being, we could still read this Mishnah as a case where you were waiting for it to come. There was intent, which means it has nothing to do with our case, and it's not the proof that Rav Nachman was looking for. Because you might have thought maybe we make Xera for those two cases. The stream from the rain or the head, maybe is not okay because of the arc. Okay, fine. Now we're moving on. So the fact that, again, Rav Nachman explained Rav, why does it work for the husband, doesn't work for the truma? Because we're going to differentiate. Chullin doesn't need intent. Kodshim needs intent. Okay, no one needs to prove how Kodshim needs intent. Everybody just takes that as a given. How do we know the Chullin doesn't need intent? Well, we're going to learn it from this Mishnah. This will be successful. Ditnan perot shenaflu letoch hamat hamayim. I have some fruits that fell into a channel of water by accident. Now we're going to talk about two issues. Number one, if my hands are impure and I put my hands in the channel to get the fruits out, does that purify my hands? This is like netilat yadayim. There's certain cases, right? Usually when you're impure, you have to go in the whole mikveh, your whole body. But there's certain types of impurity that's on your hands alone. And those just need to rinse your hands off. So that's number one issue. Number two, the fruits had never come in contact with a liquid. Now the fruits fall into this channel in order, if you remember, to be susceptible to impurity, which is totally not our topic. It just happens to be, we're reading this from a Mishnah Machshirin, and that's the topic of the Mishnah. Are the fruits susceptible to impurity? You always have to have intent for it to have gone in the water. Now obviously if it fell in the water, you had no intent. Okay, so let's read the Mishnah. If the perot fell into this channel, upashat mishi yadav tmeot unitalan, and the person who came along to pick up those fruits out of the channel of water, his hands happened to be impure, or her hands happened to be impure. Yadav tahoro. Now, they put their hands in the water. It doesn't matter that they were trying to pull out the fruits. What do you see here? Right? Their hands are pure, meaning it worked. Okay? Uperot enam b'chiyutan. But the fruits are not susceptible to impurity because they went into the water without anyone wanting them to go in the water. In fact, the person wanted them out of the water, and that's why they took them out. Okay? So that's the number one, the first case. Now, by the way, you have to assume here again that we're probably talking about prushim who like to eat chulin with purity. And that's what we're talking about, purifying your hands for chulin, because we're not talking about kodshim for truma and things like that. But im b'shvil sheyutchu yadav, im b'shvil sheyutchu yadav teorot uperot b'chiyutan. Okay, this case we don't even need anymore, but it's talking about the susceptibility and purity is going to change here. If I actually wanted to wash my hands and I put them in there and took out the fruits while I was doing it, in other words, and because I wanted my hands to get pure, well then, for sure, even the fruit, for sure my hands are good now. But not only that, the fruits, because I wanted to wash my hands anyway, I showed that I was happy the fruits were in there. And then that was already enough intent to make it susceptible to impurity. Okay, the susceptibility to impurity is a total side issue. We're going to move on. So what we have here is a final source for Rav Nachman, the second source that was now successful to say, for chulin you don't need intent, because look, this person put his hands in to get the fruits out, and it turns out the hands become pure without any sort of intent. Okay, so we started off with Rav saying to Rav Nachman, I don't understand Rav, why would he make this distinction? I would think it's the opposite. Need is so stringent, karet, it would be more severe. Well, he explained no, because it's chulin kodshim distinction. And now we just proved where. Now comes Rava with two difficulties against Rav Nachman's theory here. Eitivei Rava le Rav Nachman. Tava lechulin v'uchzak lechulin asur l'maaser.
Okay, it's a very hard sentence to read, and that's why we're going to end up rereading it and saying it means something else. But the way they understand it right now, you went in the mikveh for chulin, and you had intent that you're going to the mikveh so that you can eat chulin, b'tahara. Again, you're a prushi who treated chulin, even though you don't need to be tahor for chulin, but they were very strict about things. They ate everything b'tahara. So you went in the mikveh saying, I want to purify myself for chulin purposes. But you didn't say, I want to purify myself for Maaser Sheni, which has higher sanctity. So the way they read it is like this: Taval lechulin, you dunked for chulin, and uchzak lechulin. Now, what is uchzak lechulin according to the first interpretation? Rava thinks it means, and you had intention for chulin. Asur lemaaser, you can't eat maaser sheni produce because you're not pure for that because you didn't have intent for that. Sounds like uchzak in lo uchzak lo. Sounds like you needed intent for the chulin though. Now we just learned you don't need intent for chulin. That's what Rav Nachman said. So Rav Nachman says, no. Hachi kamar. This is how you should read it. The uchzak lechulin isn't the action you did, it's the result. Meaning, taval lechulin, you went in the mikveh for chulin, okay, without any real intent for kodshim. Well, what are you allowed to do now? Uchzak lechulin, you're pure for this. Uchzak doesn't mean I had intent. Uchzak means you actually are allowed to eat chulin, but you can't eat maaser. And then Rav Nachman reads this like he does. In other words, you just went in the mikveh without particular intent for your maaser sheni, so it's enough to allow you to eat chulin, it's just not enough for maaser sheni. Eitive, second problem. Second source that creates a problem for him, taval v'lo huchzak, ki'ilu lo taval. Same case, but it's a little different. You went in the mikveh v'lo huchzak, you didn't have intent, ki'ilu lo taval. It's as if you didn't go in the mikveh at all. Now this sounds like, if you didn't have intent for chulin, you can't even eat chulin. Now that sounds like you need intent for chulin, even. To which Rav Nachman says, no. My love ki'ilu lo taval klal. Oh, sorry. This is the first. Rava reads it as, what is this? Not ki'ilu lo taval klal. Sounds like you didn't go in the mikveh at all because you had no intent. And that would go against the way Rav Nachman explained Rav. What do you mean? Without intent, she fell in the mikveh, right? Or something happened. We don't know exactly. But she gets into the mikveh and it sounds like it does work. So why does this say it doesn't work at all? Lo ki'ilu lo taval lemaaser aval taval lechulin. When it said it's as if you didn't go to the mikveh, what it means is since you didn't have any intent, it'll help you for chulin, but it won't help you for maaser. Okay, and then he just rereads that source to say it's only telling you you're not good for maaser, and that works. Now, Husavar, when Rava heard this answer of Rav Nachman, he thought that he was just pushing him off and just making up this interpretation. It wasn't really a real interpretation, and he just kind of threw it out to get Rava off his back. But instead of Rava coming and attacking Rav Nachman and saying, what a ridiculous answer, where'd you get this from? Rava decided to do his homework. Nafik Duck, he went out and looked into it and tried to ask people, you know any Breita about this? You know anything about this? Ve'eshkach, and he found, in fact, that there was a Breita, Tanya, that says exactly the way Rav Nachman read the other Breita, which is, and then he realized Rav Nachman obviously was right. Taval v'lehuchzak, mutar lechulin v'asur l'maaser. If you went in the mikveh without any sort of intent, you can eat chulin, you can eat, right? You're good for chulin purposes, you're not good for maaser. So there you have it. Okay, that's Rav Nachman's proof for Rav. So this is all to explain Rav. Now, remember, now we kind of ignored him, but Rabbi Yochanan says she's not allowed to her husband and she's not allowed for kodshim. Now, according to this Breita, the one we just read, that Rava read, that would go completely against Rabbi Yochanan. Amar le'abai le'Rav Yosef. So Rabbi says to Rav Yosef here, le'matabit yuvte de Rabbi Yochanan meha. Why don't we bring this Breita against Rabbi Yochanan? It says here, without any intent to go in the mikveh, you're tahor for chulin. She should be allowed to go back to her husband. So how did Rabbi Yochanan, how would he explain that Breita? Because again, an Amora can't go against a Breita unless what? Unless he's supported by a different Tana. You can say, oh, I hold by somebody else. Or he can reread the source. But in this case, he's going to say, Amar Le, Rabbi Yosef says, Rabbi Yochanan huda Amar ka Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef. We can assume that Rabbi Yochanan held by a different Tana. Who's that? Titania. Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef Omer. We're talking about a pasuk that talks about washing your clothing that became leprous. Okay, and it talks about before you quarantine the garment for 7 days, you have to wash it. And then it says, and you wash it a second time. Now, after the 7 days. Now, bechubas, it has to be washed. Why does it have to say a second time? Obviously, right? We already know it's a second time because we already talked about the first time. And then it says after the 7 days, you wash it. Why does the Torah need to tell you a completely unnecessary word?
So it's to tell you, makish tichboset shniya letichboset rishona. The first washing is like the second one. The second washing is like the first washing. Now, the first washing, it says the Kohen has to do it. And obviously, the Kohen then does it with intent. So they're going to say, ma tichboset rishona lida'at, af tichboset shniya lida'at. Okay, so they're going to say, just like the first time there was the intention of the Kohen, the second one has to be done with intention as well. What does this prove? Intention is necessary for chulin. This is just a cloak, right? A garment, which is not kodshim, and yet you need intent. So we're going to say, same thing with the mikvah. If she goes in without any intent, it's not going to work to allow her to her husband, and that's the opinion that Rabbi Yochanan subscribes to. Now, they just asked a side question here. Again, we get off on a lot of side tangents. Well, if the first time the Kohen needed to do it, and you need the intent of the Kohen, does the second time need the intent of a Kohen as well? No, Talmud Lomar v'taher, there it says, and it will be pure, mikol makom in any way, meaning as long as somebody has intent that this is getting washed for the purposes of the leprosy, that's enough. Okay? It doesn't have to be the Kohen. Side point. Okay, now we have another question, and we're finally coming back to why is the sugi here, besides this time about intent, but now we're going to connect it back to our Mishnah. Now they're going to have another question on Rabbi Yochanan. The first was on what basis? And we said, Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef, even though this brighter seemed to go against, that we got it. Now we say the following. Matkevla Rav Shimi bar Ashi. So Rav Shimi bar Ashi says, Umiyamar Rabbi Yochanan hachi, how could Rabbi Yochanan say this? Doesn't Rabbi Yochanan say, Hama Rabbi Yochanan, halachak stam Mishnah? We paskin like a stam Mishnah. Okay, we paskin like a Mishnah whenever there's a Mishnah with no name attributed to it and no machloket. We paskin that way. Now, let's look at our Mishnah. Utzna nafla sakim v'shachata afapisha shachata kidar kapsula. What did we say? The knife falls, it slaughters, it doesn't work. Vehabinaban. What did they say about this? The first line of our Gemara today, and after the Mishnah, Tama de nafla hahi pilahu kshecha. Only if it fell, but if the person knocked it over, then it would be fine. And that definitely is not Rabbi Yochanan. Here we have a woman who falls into the mikveh, right? And what did we say? It doesn't work. Afagav de lo mechavin, right? And there we said, there's no intent there. There's no intent here. There it works. Here it doesn't work according to Rabbi Yochanan. V'amrinan man tanahu de lo bai kavana l'shchita. Who's the Tana? We're just repeating the whole sugya, or the beginning of the sugya. Rava, Rabbi Natan he. Okay? And Rava says the Mishnah is Rabbi Natan, and Rabbi Yochanan clearly holds like the rabbis. The rabbis say you didn't intend to slaughter, it doesn't work. The woman didn't intend to dunk, doesn't work. Okay? So now we're going to say no. Maybe Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef would make, who Rabbi Yochanan is holding by, would distinguish between the two cases. B'shchita, Filo Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef would agree. Why? Now this is a total out of the blue answer. In general, we're going to say that Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef thinks you need intent, but specifically for chulin, you don't. Why not? Because we're going to compare chulin and kodshim. Now, Midegale Rachmana, and this is the very last sugya in Menachot, you might not remember this, but mitasek bekodshim pasul. If you remember, it says there, because it says, Lirtzonchem tizbechuhu, with your wishes, with your intent, you will slaughter them. From there we learn that if somebody throws a knife and it slaughters the animal, it's not going to work for kodshim. Now, if there's a special pasuk that says it doesn't work for kodshim, what's the obvious? It obviously works for chulin. And that's why our Mishnah is an exception to the rule, according to Rabbi Yochanan. Okay? And that makes a lot of sense. Michlal de chulin lo be'inan kavana. From there you can assume, because of that pasuk, the chulin doesn't need kavana. Now we're stuck, though, with one last thing. So we explained, let's just go through. We explained that our Mishnah is Rabbi Natan. Then we moved to the Nida case, and we explained the Rava who distinguishes, chulin, kodshim distinction. Then we got to Rabbi Yochanan. He doesn't distinguish. Why not? Because he thinks you need intent. Except for shchita. Shchita is a unique exception where you don't need intent because the Torah specifically said in kodshim you need intent, which means you don't need intent for an action, anything that happens right. So in shchita, right, in chulin, you're basically going to need intent. So now it sounds like everybody thinks that shchita you need intent, right? Even Rabbi Yochanan, who disagrees in the Nida case. But we have a problem because in our Mishnah, what did we say? Rava said, the Mishnah is Rabbi Natan, the rabbis think you need intent. So now we have to explain the rabbi's position. What on earth reason could they have? We just explained that even if you say you need intent for other things, you don't need it for shchita, for chulin, shchita chulin. And that's our Mishnah. So Rabbanan, they're going to say like this. Now this is again all about the scale. Now it's true, you don't need kavanah for slaughtering, like you need kavanah for slaughtering in kodshim.
Lechaticha be'ina, but you need intent to cut. Okay? You could be intending to cut the neck of the animal, right? The simanim of the animal, not for the purposes of slaughter. That will be kosher, and chulin won't work for kachim. But you at least need intent to, right? And with their intention that you need is not intention for slaughtering, it's intention for cutting. So Amar Rava, now we finally get back to why did Rava say originally the halacha is like Rabbi Natan? When Rabbi Natan is a unique, right, a one-person opinion against the rabbis. Amar Rava, baha zechatu Rabbi Natan l'Rabbanan. This is why Rabbi Natan won out in the machloket against the rabbis, because the rabbis' theory doesn't really work with the psukim. Because remember what we said in the Mishnah? It's from v'zavachta v'achalta. Now, mikti v'chatachta, it doesn't say, and you should cut it and eat it. It says v'zavachta ktiv. Either, ibe'inan kavanah l'chaticha, if you need kavanah for cutting, which is what the rabbis require, afilu l'zvicha nami bai, then you're going to need for zvicha. If they're going to take that to the extent that you have to have intent for something, then you, right, for the action, then you have to have intent for slaughtering, because that's what the word is, not for cutting. But ilobing kavanah l'zvicha, but if you're Rabbi Natan, who says you don't need kavanah for zvicha, you just need a person's actions involved here, well then it doesn't matter, right? As long as you're hipila, that's enough, right? And then you don't need zvicha specifically, and you also don't need chaticha, l'chaticha nami lo libai, and therefore Rabbi Natan makes the most sense. Okay, last thing for today. Hechidami, we just have to go back now. So we proved, and as we started with our Mishnah, explained it's Rabbi Natan, left kind of the Chachamim aside, only at the end got back to Chachamim after we went through this Machlokes Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, explained why Rav made that distinction, Chulin Kachim. Rabbi Yochanan didn't agree because he holds Rabbi Yonasan ben Yosef, but he would agree with our Mishnah, and then that brought us back full circle to our Mishnah. Why did the rabbis say that it's no good in our Mishnah? That it's no good. And then we said, well, they don't need, right, it's not enough to have a human doing something, they need a human doing an act of cutting, even though they don't need a human doing an act of intent for slaughtering. Okay, but yes, they intended for the action of cutting the simanim. That's what the rabbis require. Now we just have one small thing that we didn't resolve, which is what is this case of the woman who accidentally gets into the mikvah? The friend pushes her into the water. Okay? Well, that's actually complete kavana. How do we know that? You don't say that's not kavana. Because, not only that, not only is it such good kavana, she would even be able to eat truma. Okay? Okay, we have all these kind of people who don't have knowledge. If they have someone who knows what they're doing and they make sure they're clean before they get into the mikvah, and they go into the mikvah and they put them in the mikvah, that works for them and they can eat truma. So that's complete intent. So Amar Papa LeRabbi Natan shenafla min hagesher uleRabbanan sheyarda lahaker. Again, Rabbi Natan and the rabbis are on a different scale here. So what was the case of Nidash and Ansah that Rav is going to say yes it works, and right Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't? LeRabbi Natan, it's that she falls from a bridge, okay, and then it really doesn't work for Kachim, right? But it will work for Chulin to Rav, and to Rabbi Yochanan it doesn't work at all. And for the rabbis, it's that she went in, but she went in to cool off. Okay, she wanted to go in the water to cool off. She just didn't want to go in to dunk for purification purposes. So that would be the case that Rav and Rabbi Yochanan have a debate, depending on whether you're Rabbi Natan or the rabbis. And with that, we finish for today. Long daf, but I did the summary along the way, so we're going to end here. And I'm wishing everyone a Shavua Tov.